the Starling forces are rarely balanced throughout the body. There is a tendency for a positive net filtration pressure, however small. So we need to have another system that effectively drains the tissues of excess fluid, all right? And that's the lymphatic system. Now, while that is likely its primary role evolutionarily, the lymphatic system, this need to drain the tissues, it creates another problem because in our tissues, it's never just nice, clean fluid, right? Because cells die, cells get infected, pathogens exist, parasites exist. Sometimes the immune system doesn't behave exactly correctly. So what we also get in the lymphatic system is in the fluid that's being drained is a bunch of crap, right? Is a bunch of trash. Bits of cell parts, bits of bacteria, bits of other things. So because of that, we don't want to just take the fluid that's drained from the tissues and dump it back into the circulation, because then we're going to have massive immune system effects, right? Because we have all these antigens now that are circulating around. All right, so what has evolved is a filtration system for the lymphatic vessels. So the lymph is the sort of sewer drain of the body, but along the way, before lymph gets back into the blood, it has to pass through at least one, usually many more than one, of these structures right here. So this is a lymph node, okay? A lymph node has many entrances around the outside. It's kind of a kidney bean shaped. Lots of entrances from the outside, one outflow from the middle of the kidney, right? From this end. So lymph flows from the lymphatic vessels where it collected through the lymph node and then out the other end. Now, surrounding these paths for fluid to pass through are immune system cells, particularly lymphocytes. Okay, that's why we call them lymph nodes. But in addition, there's also a lot of macrophages. Okay, remember macrophages are antigen presenting cells. So in the lymph node, in this little tiny organ, we've taken potentially infected fluid and we've brushed it right past the acquired immune system. In some ways, it's brilliant, right? Because we get very good exposure of the immune system to whatever pathogens happen to be coming by, okay? So our lymphatic vessels have very thin walls. Technically, they're even thinner walls than capillaries, okay? But the vessels themselves, which we call lymphatic capillaries at the beginning, they tend to be larger than the capillaries. In other words, their lumen is larger, even though their walls are thinner. So the two primary functions here are to return excess fluid and to scan that fluid for potential infectious material and then show it to the immune system so that the immune system can deal with it. Now, one of the things that I want you to see here is if you look at the lymphatic vessels, the edges don't come together like this, right? The edges kind of come together like shingles on a roof, right? Do you see that? Like they overlap. That's on purpose because it means that the downward side, this side, can sort of flap down and allow bigger things to come in. The lymphatic vessels, the capillaries are protected. It's hard to get into the capillaries. The lymphatics are not. Like anything can get into the lymphatics. These big holes, these little valves that allow, or these pores that allow things to come through, they're big enough for a macrophage to get in there, right? So they're even big enough for a parasite potentially to get in there. So they are good-sized things. So they're very permissive. They allow everything in to the valve structure. Now, the thing that this system does not have is a pump. The lymphatic vessels, there's no lymph pump. There's no lymph heart. Instead, the pumping action is very similar to the skeletal muscle pump that we talked about the other day. Lymph vessels tend to run near muscle. Okay, muscle contracts and relaxes. As it does so, there's very little pressure in the lymphatics. So when the body moves around it, those vessels are squeezed closed. Well, if you take squeezing closed together with one-way valves, we saw in the skeletal muscle system, we get a pump, right? Same thing is happening here. The lymphatic vessels have very thin valves, and as muscle contracts around them, fluid is slowly pushed forward, in other words, pushed towards the cardiovascular system. So another picture of the same thing. Here's our capillary bed, right? We know that most of the time our Starling forces are positive, so we have a net fluid is leaving the capillaries. It ends up being absorbed into the lymphatics, which are right next door, and then the lymph flows out of that lymphatic capillary and into the rest of the system. So the lymphatic capillaries aren't really tubes. They're more like cul-de-sacs, right? So fluid comes in from all around and then leaves in one direction. And just remember that that clear, watery fluid, which is what it is usually, does have a lot of stuff in it, immune system cells, bacterial cells, and so on. Here is, you can see there are big gaps between the cells, right? And you can see some of those little flap structures, those roofing tile structures like that would flap forward and allow things to come in. So they're blind, they have an irregular cross-section, they have a large diameter. Surprisingly, you might see maybe one or two lymphatics in all of your dissecting. That's how thin and small these vessels are. They're practically impossible to find.